Thank you, Zinkley. And I'm so excited to be in conversation today with Clint Smith. Hello, Clint.
Hi there. How are you?
I'm great. I've been looking forward to this conversation because, as we've said to each other before, it feels like we are in a conversation that is very long that we haven't yet had.
Mm,
So many incredible points of convergence, so many things to learn, and so here we are on leg number one.
indeed. It's good to be here.
And so, first off, of course, congratulations on your book, How the Word is Passed, New York Times number one bestseller, which
Yeah.
is a wonderful, wonderful thing for the book and for you. But also, and I imagine you think this way as well, it's a wonderful thing for the issues that we care about and that you are talking about in the book. So I want to start out in that place and ask you, what do you think is happening now? What kind of zeitgeist moment are we in where these hard conversations can be had in public about history, memory, and confronting our racial past?
Yeah, I think certainly we are in a moment where more people are recognizing uh, both our proximity to this period of history, and I say both our physical proximity to this period of history in the sense that it is the scars of slavery are embedded in our landscape and topography across this country, and our sort of temporal proximity to this period of history. I say all the time that slavery existed in this country for 250 years and has only not existed for about 150. And so this idea that an institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't would have no impact on what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is both morally and intellectually just disingenuous. And I think that we have more people who are, because of the work of scholars and activists and journalists and writers and artists, who are making it so that that past feels closer and more intimate, and that we have a more acute sense of how history has shaped our contemporary political, social, and economic infrastructure, and that in order to understand the reason why one community looks one way and another community looks another way, uh, and to understand that that is the result of people, not the people in those communities, but what has been done to those communities generation after generation, we have to understand the past and the history that has shaped what those spaces look like. And I'd be curious how it's shaping your work and how you think about so much of what you all are doing at Mellon. I know that there's a specific effort to think about memory, to think about the how and why we memorialize and what memorialization looks like or even means.
Well, yes, we've started on our biggest initiative in Mellon's history, which we call the Monuments Project. $250 million dedicated over the next several years to think about the built landscape of the United States and how and what it teaches us, and to support work that takes any number of different approaches. One would be the creation and commissioning of new memorials, and we think about monuments and memorials in a very, very broad way, beyond the rearing general on horseback, and going to thinking about collective representations, about abstract spaces that don't necessarily have figures, about ephemeral monuments, like some really, really incredible work that's being done out of the LA County Museum of Art with the Snapchat folks, where they've commissioned artists to make monuments that you can see through your phone
Mm,
on different spaces in LA. So there will be the building of, there'll be the recontextualizing of, because I think that some things, if you look at the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, I mean, there are so many of them, but the one in
right.
Richmond, and the way that the artist Dustin Klein has done those extraordinary projections onto it of, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, other freedom fighters who fought against the white supremacy that Lee embodies, and also people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, to give us a very contemporary sense of the loss of life that white supremacy is still exacting. So that would be, contextualization. Research and education is a huge part of it.
Mm.
So just what is the, creative teaching of American history in all of its different forms, and not necessarily just in the university classroom, though
Mm.
we at Mellon specialize in higher education in colleges, universities, and prisons. And then another piece will be about the removal of monuments. And again, that will come from communities. You think about the things that folks have done in their own communities, like in Selma, the Nathan Bedford Forrest statue that was, in the midst of Black Selma, I believe in front of a high school. And that when Selma first elected its first black mayor, they said, this Confederate is not who we want in our midst, teaching our children. So it was tremendously controversial and resisted, but eventually it was moved to the nearest Confederate graveyard, where I have seen it, and where it, along with the other Confederate graves, is immaculately tended today.
Mm.
So, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about how the landscape tells its stories. And we're just really excited. The time is now to do this on a wide scale, and to bring other partners in as well, so that we can get as much done as possible in the next stretch of years.
It's so interesting because so much of what animated my desire to write How the Word is Passed was shaped by watching the Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans. So watching statues of Robert E. Lee, PGT Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, these leaders of the Confederacy, and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the
Mm-hmm.
grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents
Mm-hmm.
still live on a street named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people?
Mm-hmm.
Because as your work and the work of Mellon reflects, like symbols and names and iconography are not just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that societies tell, and those stories embed themselves into the narratives that communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. Which isn't to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to erase the racial wealth gap, but it is a recognition that this is part of an ecosystem of ideas and of stories that shape how we think of and determine what certain communities do and don't deserve, and how we make sense of even what the landscape of a community looks like and how it has come to be that way.
I ask myself, one of the things I've been thinking about is, for the many years I taught at Yale University in what is called the corporation room, the, kind of nerve center of the university. There's a statue of the founder of the painting of the founder of the university. That, I would go for meetings, I would do my business. I was often the only black person. I was always, I don't think I was ever there with another black woman.
Right.
And there would be this painting, and you think he founded Yale and don't think twice. It was years before I looked in the middle of the meeting and saw the chained black slave child at the bottom corner right of the painting
Wow.
as, an exemplar of his wealth and standing.
Ooh, how
So
long was that there? Is it
before
still
I
there?
No, well, no. They did a really smart contextualization. They took it down,
Mm.
and they put it in the British Art Center Museum at Yale, and did a very elaborate sort of historical surrounding and learning
Mm.
project. So if you went and looked up Elihu Yale slave right now there, even online, you could hear the historian Jonathan Holloway talking about the painting, art historians talking about the painting, contextualizing it in the history of Yale and slavery. And so that to me seemed, at a teaching institution,
Mm.
exactly the right thing to do with that. Don't put it in the room where we say this is important. This is our most special place.
Mhm.
But learn from it, because I think it's very important to know the history of all of these places. And what about you? How do you think of some of those delayed moments where you said like, "Oh my goodness."
Yeah, I mean, my childhood is full of them. I mean, I think all the time about how one of my fondest memories of my childhood is going to City Park in New Orleans and feeding the ducks and feeding the geese with my mom. We would freeze the ends of our bread, our loaves of bread, and we'd save them over the course of a couple weeks, and we would go and feed. You know, for me, it meant like trying to get as close to the geese as possible, and then throwing it once they were like about to bite my hand, and then running away with both equal parts sort of terror and exhilaration. Um, and that experience that I look back so fondly on was literally done under the shadow of PGT Beauregard, like under the shadow of this statue that sits at the front of City Park. And I had no notion when I was a kid growing up that this is a man who was a general in an army that fought a war predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. What does it say about the priorities of this city or the history of this city in which these men on their horses and with their swords and on their pedestals sit in such prominent places, and how can that help us make sense of the way that again certain communities have been historically not even just under resourced but plundered, both intellectually and materially. And so I think part of what happens, you grow up and you learn who Robert E. Lee was and who PGT Beauregard was and who Jefferson Davis was, and it's angering and it's frustrating, but it's also profoundly clarifying because I think you have a much better sense of why our society looks the way that it does today because you have a better sense of the stories that this country has told itself for so long.
You know, I think about the challenges of making those stories material
Mm,
and making them material in a way that they're available to others. I grew up in Washington, D.C., where you live now.
mhm,
I think about a place where I went all the time to what we called Lincoln Park, where the statue of Lincoln freeing the slave, so,
mm,
freeing a representative slave, a black man kneeling, semi clothed at his feet, is one anchor side of the park. And there is a lot, people are very unhappy with that statue now. And the way that I experienced that statue was in a couple of ways. First, it was that when I was, I think, about 10 years old, the statue of Mary McLeod Bethune, the great educator, was placed at the other end of the park with children
mm,
around her. So I felt like, okay, well, Mary McLeod Bethune is telling Abraham Lincoln some things.
mhm,
She's telling him what she thinks about this. She's telling the man to get up. You're
mm.
free now. Just as she is teaching these children. That was my childhood understanding of seeing this great black woman and this venerated white man. I knew how that conversation had to go
Right.
in real life. But then to take it further, when I learned that at the dedication of the Lincoln statue, that Frederick Douglass himself was part of the dedication,
Mm,
spoke alongside President Ulysses Grant, spoke to most members of Senate and the Supreme Court were there, and then among other things, he criticized the statue
mm.
and criticized the kneeling, half naked, formerly enslaved man. It was a great Frederick Douglass, if you go and look at it, it's a great Frederick Douglass speech.
There's so many of them.
Exactly. I mean, he usually doesn't fail.
Yeah.
So, what I feel like is all of these layers are so interesting. How could we make those visible, knowable, accessible?
What do you think about the sort of idea of, and I know a lot different places have wrestled with this in different ways, but instead of taking a statue, an offensive statue down, whether it be to the Confederacy or to something controversial like the statue of Lincoln that you mentioned, and having another, and not necessarily taking it down, but placing other statues that serve as a different perspective or shape a different narrative. Because I asked in part because I went to Maryland's Eastern Shore about a year ago for Juneteenth, and I went with my family. to see, because I wanted to go to the birthplace of Frederick Douglass, and I went to the county where he was born, and there's a statue of Douglass in front of the courthouse of the county where he was born. And so on one side of the courthouse lawn is a statue of Frederick Douglass, and it's very well done. Um, and then on the other side of the lawn is a statue dedicated to people from that county who fought for the Confederacy. And
Mm.
it was such an interesting, it was a sort of moment of cognitive dissonance, right? To both have on the same lawn in front of the same courthouse these two statues that represented not only like differing opinions, but fundamentally different values and sort of ideological projects, um,
Hmm.
and different senses of what freedom was and who freedom was meant for. I'm curious how, if there's a sort of institutional way you all are thinking about that, or does it depend on the local context? And
So many different ways to do it, and I think that in part, relying on the artists to really come up with powerful interpretations in the way that, say, Hank Willis Thomas did with a photograph of a Black Power Afro pic that was set looming over a statue of Frank Rizzo,
mm,
who's former mayor and police commissioner of Philadelphia, who really governed with a reign of racist, violent
mm,
terror through the mechanism of the police department. So juxtaposition of Black Power bigger than Frank Rizzo is suddenly that's a
mm,
conversation, and only an artist could dream that up. But also, I think that the beauty of the perspective of Black studies and of all of the hyphenated, ethnic studies and gender studies and LGBTQ studies has been the understanding of simultaneity of perspectives, but not necessarily of weighting things equally,
mm,
because we're up against a landscape that if we've actually commissioned some research to get really good numbers, but for what we know so far, the representation of women, of people of color, I mean, the percentages are minuscule. One of the interesting things of the representation of women in public and memorial spaces is that they are usually allegorical or fictive women who never lived.
mm.
More statues of Juliet and Alice in Wonderland
Wow.
than of actual flesh and blood American women.
Huh.
So I think that what that means is one for one is not going to reach parity. One for one is not going to give us the dynamic conversation. This is a moment for an overhaul.
Mm.
And there are so many different ways to do it. We were going to conclude with some poems, and so much we didn't get to talk about. But another thing that you and I share is we are people who think and write in different media, but some say the poet part is the heart.
Mm.
So I would love a poem of yours that I love so much if you would read your national anthem for us.
I'd be happy to. Your national anthem. Today, a black man who was once a black boy like you got down on one of his knees and laid his helmet on the grass as this country sang its ode to the promise it never kept. And the woman in the grocery store line in front of us is on the phone, and she is telling someone on the other line that this black man who was once a black boy like you should be grateful we live in a country where people aren't killed for things like this. You know, she says, in some places they would hang you for such a blatant act of disrespect. Maybe he should go live there instead of here so he can appreciate what he has. And then she turns around and sees you sitting in the grocery store cart surrounded by lettuce and yogurt and frozen chicken thighs, and you smile at her with your toothless gum smile, and she says you are the cutest baby she has ever seen, and tells me how I must feel so lucky to have such a beautiful baby boy. And I thank her for her kind words, even though I should not thank her, because I know that you will not always be a black boy, but one day you will be a black man, and you may decide your country hasn't kept its promise to you either. And this woman, or another like her, will forget you were ever this boy, and they will make you into something else, and tell you to be grateful for what you've been given.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank
I would
you.
love to hear a poem from you, a favorite of mine, Apollo.
Yes, I was so interested that you chose that one. That's an oldie.
Yes, a classic, as they say.
Well, this poem is called Apollo, and I think that we always live in history. Every single one of us, whether we're aware of it at the time or not. Apollo. We pull off to a road shack in Massachusetts to watch men walk on the moon. We did the same thing for 321 Blast Off, and now we watch the same men bounce in and out of craters. I want a Coke and a hamburger. Because the men are walking on the moon, which is now irrefutably not green, not cheese, not a shiny dime floating in a cold blue the way I'd thought. The Road Shack people don't notice we are a black family not from there, the way it mostly goes. This talking through static, bouncing in space boots tethered to cords is much stranger, stranger even than we are.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for asking. Thank you for the conversation. It's been beautiful and it shall be continued.
It's always too quick, but I know we'll have many more.
Yes, thank you.